After 8 years, 366 episodes, 4 movies, 2 specials, and an OVA, the last episode of Bleach aired in Japan on March 27, 2012. An ending that was seen as abrupt by all fans and followers of the story of substitute Shinigami Ichigo Kurosaki, with an entire arc missing the end of the story due to many complications, mainly the fact that the animation was about to catch up to the manga, and because the author, the great Tite Kubo, had many health problems that didn't allow him to continue writing his work at that time. The Bleach anime had to be canceled until now, where it continued 10 years later. So today, we'll once again talk about our favorite Soul Reaper in Bleach, Thousand Year Blood War. The story begins by introducing the Quincy King, the Quincy being a race capable of destroying the Hollows, creatures named as such due to the hole in the middle of their bodies. They once were souls but became corrupted thanks to their negative thoughts, and their faces are covered by white masks. Instead of purifying them and sending them to rest in peace in the Soul Society like the Shinigami Soul Reapers do with their swords known as Zanpakuto, we are told that this king recovers his pulse after 900 years, his mind after 90, his strength after 9, and something more. We are quickly shown the Development Institute of the Soul Society commanded by Captain Kuratsuchi in an emergency situation due to the sudden disappearance of hundreds of Hollows who are entering the human world. We can meet 2 young Shinigamis with last names that sound familiar, Shino Madarame and Ryunosuke Yuki, who are being observed by someone else in the distance. As they are quite inexperienced, they were surrounded and gravely wounded by some stronger than average Hollows. When Ryunosuke is about to be killed, the Hollow that was pursuing him is cut in half by an attack that all of us Bleach lovers know very well, the Getsuga Tenshu. The youngsters are saved by our group of protagonists, led by the long-awaited Ichigo Kurosaki. Having incredible soul power is seen as a meeting point by all the nearby Hollows. But they are no match for this team that shows off some of the most iconic abilities of each character. Orihime Ino, defending with her shield called Santen Kessen, Sato Kesatora, with his Brazo Izquierdo del Diablo, attacks the largest Hollow using La Mert. Our Quincy, Uryu Ishida, strikes multiple Hollows with a hail of arrows called Lichtregen, which lands very close to Ichigo, and the latter uses his Shinigami powers now completely restored as we saw at the end of Bleach, with a beautiful animation quality, and activates his Bankai, the final evolution of the Zanpakuto, which gives more power to its wielder, defeating the last enemies of his iconic Getsuga Tenshu. Ryunosuke wakes up Ichigo's room 2 days later, ready to eat some food, and Shino attacking Ryunosuke for the grief he caused her. This nice scene is suddenly interrupted by a man who enters through the window and lays on Ichigo's bed, introducing himself as Ibern Asguaro, whom our protagonist recognizes as an Arrancar, a Hollow that managed to rip its mask off, obtaining Shinigami powers as a result. These were the most powerful enemies that they faced in the first anime. Ichigo knocks him down with a single kick, but Ibern becomes angry when they call him Arrancar and lunges at our protagonist, but instead of showing a Zanpakuto like an Arrancar should, he shows a Quincy Cross, shocking Ichigo because his friend Oryu is the last survivor of the race. We then quickly see Yumichika and Ikaku investigating the disappearance of all the inhabitants of a town in Rukon District where many characters we know were raised. We quickly see Captain Commander Yamamoto, Maximum Eminence of the Gote 13, a military corps of the Soul Society composed of 13 squads, in his office about to receive a report on the situation, which is interrupted by a group that presents itself as Wandenreich, which declares war on him. The scenes alternate between Ichigo's fight against Ibern and the conversation of Yamamoto and the group, who is interrupted at one point by the impact against one of the walls of Sasakibi's office. Lieutenant of the Captain Commander, Yamamoto, seeing his comrade bleeding out and about to die, attacks the group with a strike that destroys the office, but those people were already gone, just like Ibern, who was fighting Ichigo after almost destroying the power of his Bankai with a strange German ritual. The scene changes to the Wandenreich group and Ibern getting a report of the Quincy King who kills one of his subordinates. Back in Ichigo's room, we receive the report on the situation of the Soul Society confirming the death of over 100 Shinigamis, among them Lieutenant Sasakibi, making our protagonists grieving and thinking about what happened. The Quincy King kills more of his minions, and we can see that Haribel is in chains. Once again, we return to Ichigo and the gang when Pechi Guatich, a companion of Nell, arrives and explains that how Haribel was the ruler of Huako Mundo, but was defeated and made prisoner. Ichigo decides to help them when Iryu refuses to do so because he's a Quincy. He is still worried, and Urahara arrives to take them to Huako Mundo immediately. Now in Huako Mundo, we can see how the members of Wandenreich are harassing a group of Arrancar, among them Loli and Minoli, loyal followers of Aizen, chief antagonist of the main story, who react to the situation, and with them arrives a group of Arrancar known as the Tres Bestias, a trio of powerful women who follow Haribel. They are no match for their enemies, so Ichigo springs into action facing the strongest opponent who uses techniques that remind him of his friend Iryu. While this is happening, the Tres Bestias summon Aeon, a hollow that for a moment could manage the situation, but in the end was absorbed by the Quincy. Meanwhile, in the Soul Society, the captains meet and arrive at the conclusion that their enemies are once again the Quincy, and they will not sit idly by. During the squad's preparations, we once again see Shino and Ryunosuke introducing us to Kajo Maru, the new officer who explains the story behind the conflict between the Quincy and the Shinigami, telling us that the former eradicated the hollow, unbalancing the amount of souls, while the latter purified them to maintain said balance. We are told that 200 years ago, the Quincy were exterminated by the unbalance that affected the Soul Society, and Captain Karuchi adds that Yamamoto wasn't able to defeat the Quincy King at the time. Then the king arrives with his minions at the Soul Society. We are introduced to a few of them, and we notice that each of them is named after a letter of the alphabet, with V, F, and E appearing, and revealing that one fighting Ichigo is called J. We can also see some battles starting between our captains against those Quincies, but mainly those of Byakuya, Kamamura, Hitsugaya, and Soifan, who are no match for them. And on top of that, they are able to steal their Bankai. Urahara is brought up to date with the situation in the Soul Society by Officer Akin, and we notice that Ichigo's Bankai once again is unable to be absorbed. The battle is interrupted by Urahara, who temporarily immobilizes his rival to explain the three powers of the Quincy: the Volstern Dich, which is similar to a Bankai, the Blut, which allows them to control and absorb the particles of soul power, and lastly, the ability to steal Bankais through objects and rituals. Our enemy Jay frees himself by gravely wounding Urahara, who is trying to carry Ichigo back to the Soul Society and is left stuck between the two worlds. During his battle against F, Byakuya is afraid for the first time in years and is defeated by his own Bankai. Ichigo, from his location, can feel all the losses in the war, while the Shinigami, we all know, await his arrival. We notice that Hisagi is no rival for the Stern Ritter O, who claims to have killed Sasakibi. And we see a scene from Captain Commander's past that we learn the origin of the scar on his head, which was caused precisely by Sasakibi Bankai 2,000 years ago. Immediately after that, we return to the present day, and we see how O wants to use Sasakibi's Bankai against Yamamoto, and the latter is hit directly by the attack. For the first time, he becomes enraged and majestically avenges the death of his friend by completely incinerating his rival. Meanwhile, Uryu, ignoring his father's warning of delving into the past, searches for information regarding his Quincy lineage, finding his grandfather's diary on his father's desk, learning of a war that took place 1,000 years ago between Shinigamis and Quincies. Back in the Soul Society, Kenpachi is defeated by the king. Yamamoto arrives, and we learn that the king's name is Yowatch. We also see that he uses a sword. The Quincy only use soul power bow and arrows. An extreme heat is felt all over the Soul Society, and during that time, the true king was hidden in the central underground prison, where Aizen, the most important and powerful antagonist from the first anime, is imprisoned. The king saw Aizen as a threat, and that's why he tried to convince him to join forces, but he wasn't successful. After realizing that he used all of his power in vain, Yamamoto lowers his guard, and the real Yowatch steals his Bankai and splits him in two, exclaiming that the Shinigamis were always stronger, but that achieving balance and peace made them weak. Ichigo frees himself and sees how many of the captains, the strongest Shinigami he knew, were defeated. With the last of his strength, Byakuya pleads him to protect the Soul Society. At certain moments, Ichigo uses BLEACH as an armor, a Quincy ability. Yuwatch explains why the soul cage he was held in didn't work. It was meant for Shinigamis. But his mother was a Quincy, and that means Ichigo is part Quincy and so was able to break free. When Ichigo is about to be defeated, the Quincy run out of time and return to their base in Hukomundo, due to the fact that when the king was with Aizen in prison, he lost consciousness for a few seconds while they retreat. Yuwatch calls Ichigo his son, and his subordinate, Hashwolf, destroys his Zanpakuto while in Bankai state. Unohana's squad begins to act, trying to save the most amount of lives possible, while Ichigo, after receiving first aid, meets several old acquaintances, and at the same time, the captains gather around the broken Zanpakuto of the captain commander. Ichigo finds out that his Bankai cannot be fixed with conventional means, and we are introduced to Squad Zero, which corresponds to the Soul King of the Soul Society. It's composed of 5 Shinigamis that surpass the power of the 13 captains we already know. They take Ichigo, Byakuya, Renji, and Rukia away, and they tell Ichigo that he should replace his Bankai. The way to reach heaven is through the already well-known Kukaku Shiba, relative of our protagonist, since she belongs to the same clan as his father, and we notice that along Ganju Shiba, they are training some of the members of Execution, a group formed by Fullbringers that were defeated in the last arc of the Bleach. Once in heaven, we can see that aside from the king, every captain from Squad Zero has their own small palace, and we learn that every captain learned their own technique that makes them stand out from the rest. In the first palace, we meet Tenjiro Kenariji, who taught Unohana how to develop hers, and heals both our protagonist and Renji by spending a night in hot springs. The next palace is that of Kiryu Hikafune, where our characters are offered huge amounts of food, and we learn that this captain was the creator of modified souls such as Kan, the soul that Ichigo used in his body to carry out his tasks as a substitute Shinigami with increased peace of mind while he was in the human world. On the other hand, Captain Kairaku is named Captain Commander and decrees that he will have 2 lieutenants, Okikiba and Naneo, and tasks Captain Unohana with training Kenpachi. Since it was revealed that she is the first Kenpachi, it serves as a name of Kenpachi Zaraki since he didn't have one, but in reality it's a title granted to the strongest of people, and also one of the most famous criminals in history. The training consisted in a battle of the death that they could never achieve, where Kenpachi made a scar on Unohana's chest, which she always covers with her hair. It's clear that in this battle only one of them will survive, since there can only be one Kenpachi. We see Yachiru, lieutenant of Kenpachi with her characteristic eye patch, and Aisane Kutetsu, lieutenant, crying over her goodbye letter. For the first time, we see Unohana's Bankai, and she manages to gravely wound her opponent many times, but she quickly heals him every time since every mortal wound makes him stronger. At the end of the battle, Kenpachi is victorious, and we understand that this was the only way for him to awaken his Zanpakuto. Back in heaven, we meet Otetsu Nimai, surrounded by women that actually are nothing more than Zanpakutos, and we are told that he is the forger of every Zanpakuto in existence. More specifically, the Asauchi. That's what they call nameless swords, that through their use, Shinigamis imprint their souls on them. Otsu's training consisted in throwing Ichigo and Renji down a pit full of Asauchis so that they may find their own. But in the next episode, we can see Ichigo once again in the real world at the door of his house saying that he was expelled from a royal palace. With his mission failed, he goes to work as if it was normal, albeit a rainy day. While he was talking to his boss, Ikumi, his father, Ishin, arrives in the form of a Shinigami, which means his boss cannot see him. Ichigo leaves with his father, letting his Shinigami substitute badge fall. Ishin tells Ichigo how he met his mother, Masaki Kurosaki, who as a little girl was adopted by the Ishida family because she was a Quincy. We see that Raikin, father of Ryu, Ichigo's friend, wanted to marry her to make her happy, but mostly his parents who wanted to maintain the blood of the Quincy's pure for many generations. At that time, Isshin Shiba was already a captain and was in charge of Rangaku and future Captain Hitsugaya. News arrives that many Shinigami who patrolled the human world died, and so Isshin begins the most powerful and fearing for his people acts quickly to find out what was the problem. In his presence, other two Shinigamis are wounded, revealing the author of such crimes. It was some kind of hollow in black armor, but with his hole filled in, called White by his creator. This creature fought like Shinigami, but had the appearance and powers of a hollow. This was nothing more than one of Aizen's experiments that, along with Tozen and Ichimaru, kept trying to complete hollowification, which we previously saw failing with Shinji Hirayaku, Y, and his group. The hollowification method consisted in granting the powers of a hollow to a Shinigami, and this way they could awaken a greater power. These beings are called Vizard. With the rain as the sole witness of the battle, when Isshin is about to finish off the creature with his Shikai, he's attacked from behind by none other than Aizen, who luckily Masaki felt the power of both of them and ignored Raikin, who was opposed to going to help the young Shinigami. Masaki catches the creature's attention, lets herself be bitten by it, and kills it, but not before exploding. Seeing this, Isshin rushes over with great speed and moves it as far away from Masaki as possible, but she's safe. She approaches the young Shinigami, and knowing the story between their races, she fearfully introduces herself by telling him her name and stating she's a Quincy, thus receiving a satisfactory answer from the person he had just saved. Raikin was watching the whole thing from the distance along with Katagiri, a maid of the Ishida family. Isshin reports what happened to the rest of the captains, but without mentioning the Quincy he just met, keeping her very present in his mind, and Masaki was doing the same. But when she arrives at home from school, she's met by Raikin's mother, who berates her for having exposed herself to such danger and reveals that Katagiri told her that she was wounded. In that moment, Masaki collapses to the floor and a hole similar to that of the hollows begins forming. Witnessing this, Raikin goes in search of help, and while he regrets not having stopped her the previous night, they are both attacked by a hollow that is quickly cut in two by none other than Isshin Shiba, who decided to patrol to the human world to see the girl again. Then Kaisuke Urahara appears, who already knew something was wrong with Masaki, and takes them to her store to explain what was happening to her, hinting that here was only one solution. She was turning into a hollow, and since she was a Quincy, she needed to bind her soul with a Shinigami to survive. After arguing with Raikin, Isshin takes the decision of abandoning his life as a Shinigami to become an ordinary person so that he may save her. Inside Masaki's body, we see how Isshin uses a Getsuga Tenshu to destroy the hollow. Raikin felt that he lost the love of his life, and even worse, it was against a Shinigami. He leaves under the rain and meets Katagiri, who tells him that she was always there for him ever since they were children, and they return home together. Time passes and we see that Isshin, with the knowledge he had of the Soul Society, opens his clinic, and Masaki, now graduated, left the house where she lived and recurrently goes to visit Isshin. And thus a relationship between them starts to form. Back to the present, Isshin tells his son the true reason why his mother, being so powerful, lost her life against a hollow when Ichigo was a kid, and it was because the Quincy King awakened after 990 years through Aswalan, an ability to rob the power of those Quincy he considered impure. This also removed all vital force from Katagiri, Iryu's mother. Now that Ichigo knew the truth, he finally understood everything as a way to thank his Shinigami father. When Rukia pierced him with her sword, it awakened his powers because her mother was bitten by a hollow, and he had the strength of these creatures in the times he needed it most, thus breaking the bond between the hollow and Isshin. The latter recovered his powers, and lastly, because his mother was a Quincy, he also inherited part of her powers. Thus, he finally understood why Iwatch called him son the day he beat him. Since he was half Quincy, he had the blood of the king in him, just like all Quincy's. When it's finally daytime, Ichigo thinks of a way to return to the Soul Society, and in that moment, one of Otsu's Zanpakuto women appear to take him, and opens his eyes in the pit where he was, but not before his boss Ikumi gives him his substitute Shinigami badge that he dropped at work. Back to the pit, we can see how all the Asauchis bow before the Shinigami, and he decides to choose one, which after being touched turns white. Her face becomes like that of a hollow, and her hair turns similar to that of her new wielder. We go to the Soul Society and we see how Hitsugaya, Shohei, Karatsuchi, Soifan, and Komamura train and become stronger in their own ways after being defeated in the recent battles. Ichigo arrives at the forge and meets Otsu's bodyguards, 5 waifus that help him in the process of forging his new sword. But before meeting her, he must say goodbye to his old sword that was called Zangetsu, materialized as the man that always accompanied him. Inside Ichigo, we learn that actually the Zangetsu we knew was an imposter that took the form of Yuach from 1,000 years ago, and that's why Ichigo felt that the Quincy King looked familiar. We always saw this man in the world inside Ichigo, who represented his inner hollow. He always saved his life during his most difficult moments, while the man we know as Zangetsu never did anything more than lend him a bit of his power, representing the Quincy heritage he always ignored while he chose his Shinigami heritage. Zangetsu leaves, allowing Ichigo to finally use 100% of his potential. With his departure, we can also see the Hollow Ichigo, and we finally see our protagonist with not one but 2 swords, one of them representing his hollow power and of course the other one representing his Quincy power. After this final scene, we can see how Uryu, dressed like a Wandenreich, approaches the Quincy King and he accepts him as his new subordinate. This leaves us with great expectations of what is to come in the next season, which will not take long to arrive since the continuation of this incredible anime will come soon. So this was the summary of Bleach: 1,000-Year Blood War. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if that's the case, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the summaries I'll be uploading in the coming days. That's all for today. Goodbye.